Welcome to Back in Crime, a podcast presented by Texas Crime Travelers. I'm Stewart Fillmore, retired FBI agent.
And I'm Todd Hiles, retired Secret Service agent. In this podcast, we cover cases we worked and some we wish we had.
As lifelong street agents, we were where the rubber met the road.
While the big guys were doing press conferences, we were interviewing the criminals.
And because of that, we can take you inside these cases
and under the crime scene tape.
This is Back in Crime.
Welcome back.
Hey, everybody.
Our last episode was part one of the JFK Assassination, where we discussed the possibility of a second shooter on the South Knoll.
Yeah, so this is part two, and so buckle yourselves in because this one's going to be even better.
And again, for our listeners, don't forget, this is a three-part series on the JFK assassination.
Yes, yeah.
And this series is based on compelling evidence uncovered in the last few months by you, Stewart.
Well, yeah, in consultation with you and some other of our peers to make sure that some of this stuff is that I'm not crazy and that and that I'm not I've said before I try to avoid having what's called confirmation bias, and that is that I just put blinders on and now I'm just focused on one thing here, because some of the things that I found are somewhat counterintuitive to either the official story of a lone gunman, or I'm also differ somewhat with what some conspiracy researchers have found, and we'll get into that today. You know.
So really recapping episode one is you found this photograph of a car that would be. Tell me what you thought.
Yeah, so my starting point was the wounds that were described by the Parkland Doctors.
Right.
And I found this photograph. It's a famous photograph called the Cancellari number 5, and it shows Dealey Plaza, but for the most part, it's looking to the west, which it's looking to the area that would have been in front of the president as he's going through Dealey Plaza.
And the guy that took that picture, first name was Frank.
Yeah,
and he actually was a photographer. He was actually in the motorcade.
He was in the motorcade.
And he got
a few
out
cars back.
Right.
And then within a minute of the fatal headshot, Cancellari, who was a photographer for the United Press International (UPI), it wasn't just him. There were several newsmen that
took pictures.
Started taking pictures, but his photograph in particular catches the view that would have been exactly in front of the president, and which includes the South Knoll. And so if you zoom into this Cancellari photograph,
that's where you see the car.
Yes, about 15 feet from the end of what's called the triple underpass bridge, where there's a wall on top of that bridge, and where that wall ends, this car is parked about 15 feet just south of that. And it's sitting by itself, and there's clearly a human shape in this car. And so going back to what I had found described by the Parkland doctors, particularly Dr. Malcolm Perry, who had the closest observation of this neck wound, this throat wound that President Kennedy had, and he described some of the wound path or some of the wounding associated, with that, with what he saw. I was able to construct a bullet path from this wound path that basically pointed exactly to where this car is, and so going off the assumption then that there there's a human in this car, that could this have been a shooter in the front? Because again, what the Parkland doctors described was a small wound in the front and a larger hole in the back of the head. These are indicative of a shooter from the front. So assuming then that this person that you can see in Cancellari's photo in the car is the shooter in the front, it occurred to me that maybe could the bullet have, would the bullet have exited somehow, and would there be any evidence of that? And so following that line of thought, I just traced that same line that established by the wound path in Kennedy's neck that pointed to the car. I just extended that behind Kennedy.
Right.
And in doing so, I found 2 bullet holes that were on the front face of the Texas School Book Depository that fell almost perfectly on that line.
And it's more than a coincidence that all these pieces fit together.
Oh man, let me add a couple of things to this that just seem to be more than coincidence. One is the FBI. There's an FBI report of the Dallas police, information that the FBI got from the Dallas police that 2 days before the assassination, that men had been seen near the scene of the assassination. That's just the best description that we have in the report, sighting in a rifle. And so kind of all the analysis of the bullet path and the angles and the elevation and all that, I kind of assessed that that's what these bullet holes are. I don't think they were part of the assassination.
And they further described that they were in an older model car.
Yeah. This FBI report describes that they were in that these men sighting in this rifle were seen in the vicinity of an old model car. So I meant to follow up on that in our last episode, and so I wanted to just quickly explain something else that again goes with what you said about this is way too many coincidences.
Right.
So in April of 1963, there was a controversial guy that lived in Dallas named General Edwin Walker. He was an extreme right-wing figure that I think at one point ran for governor of Texas. He was controversial in that he didn't like Kennedy. He like I said, he held these extreme right-wing positions.
All right.
So in April of 63, someone took a shot at General Walker while he was inside his house in Dallas through a window. The shot missed. It struck like a part of a window. At the time, whoever did the shooting got away. But there was a witness that lived kind of behind Walker in the vicinity of where they lived. There was also a church, and there was a parking lot associated with the church. And I think Walker's house was actually right next door to the church, and adjacent to the parking lot. And the neighbor that was there was maybe on the other side of the parking lot.
Did the neighbor have a description of a car
that
got away?
Yeah, so the neighbor heard the shot and then immediately goes and looks out over a fence to where the church parking lot is and sees two men walking in a very kind of hurried pace toward two cars that were parked in the church parking lot. And one of those cars was the witness described as a 1949 or a 1950 Ford sedan. Okay. And that these two men got in the cars and left. Later investigation found that that nobody that would have been at the church was associated with those cars. Okay. Part of it, the car is obscured by shrubbery. Right. Exactly. And I think that might have actually been, if there was a shooter in there, that might have actually been deliberate. Right. But you can see the top of the car. You can see the roof of the car, in some portion of the rear passenger side quarter panel. If you take a photo shot from a similar angle of a 1949 Ford sedan and you superimpose that over the South Knoll car, okay, it matches almost perfectly. So, certainly by 1963, a 1949 Ford would have been considered an old model car. Right. So there's one other thing that maybe, is there a common denominator between this car being at the Walker shooting and, at the South Knoll? Now, later investigation, confirm or by the Warren Commission said
that's what I was going to say.
Said that Oswald was, had taken the shot at General Walker.
Right, and that was information that was supplied by Oswald's wife. She testified that that's what happened. And again, that's in the Warren Commission, and we talked about that in episode 1. Yeah. So for listeners, they can go back.
So again, so the point is, there's a whole lot of things that seem to match with forensic evidence that we know based on these wounds that all kind of tie to this car that's in the photo, and then you have bullet holes, so right. Like you said, I just think that's more than coincidence.
Right. So let's kick off part 2 here.
Hey everyone, before we get started, this episode contains graphic descriptions of gunshot wounds, related medical procedures, and suicide. These topics are discussed due to the nature of the episode, and some listeners may find the content distressing. Please listen with care, and if you or someone you know is struggling, we encourage you to seek support from a trusted resource.
After you found those 2 bullet holes in the school book depository,
right,
what did you do next?
Okay, so the next thing that I'm considering is, well, okay, let's assume that there is a shooter in this car and that he made that throat shot.
All right.
I just started speculating, could he have also, made the headshot that we all see in the Zapruder film that's quite graphic, is, where the president's head explodes.
Yeah, you brought up Zapruder film.
Yeah.
So let's just let our listeners know that Zapruder was out there watching the motorcade go by, and he had a movie camera.
He was on the north side of Elm Street as the president came down, as the limousine came down Elm Street. He had a view, and kept the car in frame for the most part. It gets to the bottom of the frame a little bit at one point, but you see the limousine the entire time it's coming down Elm Street.
So his film actually captures the assassination.
It captures the assassination.
But there were other people out there that had movie cameras too. There were just a few other people, right?
Yeah, there was. There were several people actually in Dealey Plaza that had movie cameras that captured various parts of the motorcade as it went through. But really, I think there are people that are far more expert in this than I am. But there was one other that captured the assassination, but it was from it's called the Nix film, and it was from a distance away, a little further away, and you don't see the detail that you do in the Zapruder film.
Okay.
Yeah.
And where was Nix standing then?
So Nix was standing, believe it or not, on the south side of Dealey Plaza, more toward like where Commerce Street is, and maybe between Commerce and Main Street.
Okay.
And the South Knoll would have been to his left.
To his left.
To his left at that point.
So if he would have heard a gunshot, all he needed to do
all he had to do was just flash that his camera just turned to his left, and
he could have possibly
maybe
filmed,
history would have changed here.
He could have possibly filmed the second shooter.
Yeah. So and that's something we're going to talk about too. Is maybe if there was a shooter over there, why didn't we hear anything?
Okay.
So but we'll get to that. Yeah. So we have this, I think, some pretty compelling evidence to consider at least that there is a shooter on this South Knoll. And so I just considered, well, could he have made, this other shot that was to the president's head that's clearly the fatal headshot? So if we recall that when President Kennedy arrived at Parkland Hospital, the main description by the doctors there was that he had a small, clean, round wound to the throat, and he had a gaping hole in his right occipital region of his head. That's the right back part of his head, lower part of his head. The doctors saw this hole in the throat. They saw this hole in the back of his head, but also with that wound in the back of the head, there was a specific part of the brain that was observed to be lacerated or torn, that was exuding, from the wound.
Okay.
That's the cerebellum. Cerebellum is a specific part of the brain that's located at the base of the brain and to the rear. Okay.
Okay.
So that's interesting. So I speculated, well, how could a bullet get to that part of the and damage the brain in there? It's going to have to come from a specific angle. Many people have long suspected that this headshot that you see in the Zapruder film where the president's head explodes, that shooter was on what's called the grassy knoll and was behind a fence over there. Give a brief description. The grassy knoll is it's just a small incline. That's kind of wooded, has some grass and some trees and some shrubbery up there. It's on Dealey Plaza, and it's on the north side of Elm Street.
And let me just say, it's always been long rumored that that's where the actual shots came from.
Oh yeah,
and there's been thousands of books written about a shooter on the grassy knoll.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, you have people. There's a gentleman named James Files that has claimed to be the shooter. Okay, and I will say that if you look at his information, it's pretty compelling.
Okay.
And so he spins a pretty good story that in some ways makes a lot of sense. Anyway, so like I said, the grassy knoll's on the north side of Elm Street. And the South Knoll, as we've talked about, is really, it's kind of the mirror image of the grassy knoll, just on the south side. There's no denying that there's some suspicious activity with that. But let's go back and talk about let's stick back with the South Knoll on this point.
All right.
Okay. So what we're going to find is that ultimately, as the investigation proceeds, that there's going to be some problems with this gaping hole that's in the rear, because what's important about it is it's indicative of a shot from the front. That's indicative of an exit wound. Okay.
And we know the Warren Commission has always said that Oswald was from the back.
Correct.
That he's the lone shooter.
He's
and
the
he was
lone
from
shooter,
the back.
and he's in a position up to the back and to the upward and to the right of the president. So this kind of this gaping hole is a problem.
Right.
Right. So at the president's autopsy, which was done at the Bethesda Naval Hospital, there were some X-rays taken and some photographs. In fact, there's one photograph that shows the back of the president's head to be completely intact. So that's at odds with what the Parkland doctors saw. But again, when I set out to look into this, I just thought I'm going to proceed as if I'm responding that day, and the only witnesses I have available are the Parkland doctors. And so I'm going to follow up on what they say.
And they're telling you that he had these wounds from the front.
Correct. Wounds that seem to imply a shooter in the front. Right. Just like I did with throat shot, I started assessing, the possible bullet paths of, where this headshot could come from, and there is a JFK assassination researcher named Dr. David Mantic, and he's a very, very accomplished guy. He's a radiologist and a physicist. He's written a number of books about his work in looking into specifically into the X-rays that were taken of the president at the time of his autopsy.
Okay. All right.
Now, Mantic is, like I said, he's a very accomplished man. He's very smart. There's no question he's an expert in X-rays and the technology of X-rays, and he very in detail describes that in his books. So much so that I have a hard time kind of following, what he's saying sometimes. I think I can summarize his work as basically saying that what Mantic has found is that there's evidence of forgery in that right occipital region of the skull in the X-rays, and that the X-rays do show evidence of two gunshot entry wounds, one from the front and one from the rear.
Right.
Okay.
And the one from the rear, that position from the rear would be from the school book depository.
Yes. And as I go through this, I'm going to explain, again, I've done the same kind of analysis of the trajectories and everything, and it does, that there is a particular shot that does appear to line up with a shooter being in that position.
Okay.
And that's the position that the Warren Commission concluded is where Oswald was.
Okay.
Dr. Mantic has actually viewed the original X-rays a number of times that are contained in the National Archives. Those are not publicly available. You have to get the permission of the Kennedy family to view those, and he has viewed those in person, and he's used very sophisticated methods to analyze the X-rays, and so that again he describes this in his books. I refer people to look into that, but it is very technical. How he describes it.
Do you think on the news that we had a week and a half ago with President Trump releasing some of these new documents that have been classified, do you think that some of these documents that President Trump is talking about that he wants released to the public? Or
I don't think it's going to relate to that.
Okay.
And I think certainly we need to discuss, that because that is critical. But I don't think that's going to have anything to do with that. I could be wrong. I just, because frankly, we just don't know what's still there. So Dr. Mantic essentially thinks that there were two gunshot wounds to the head. Last November, I actually went to a conference where he spoke, and I will admit that in just reading his work, I was having trouble kind of understanding and grasping it. When I saw him in person and was able to maybe see his presentation, where he described what you're seeing in these X-rays in person, and then I was able to ask a couple of follow-up questions, I really kind of I see what he's saying, and it's very clear to me. But the two shots the two entry points that he's describing that you can see in the skull X-rays, and we will. These are all going to be. We're going to provide photos of all these.
Okay.
Okay. The first one happens at what's called the EOP. That is the external occipital protuberance. Okay. It's a mouthful. And everybody has that. It's something you can feel. It's that bump that's on the back of your head. Okay.
All right.
There was a gunshot wound, an entry wound, very close to that EOP. In fact, the autopsy describes that as being the entry wound of the entry for Oswald's shot. Okay. That's what they say. So Dr. Mantig is in agreement that there is an entry wound at the EOP, and this is in the back of the head. So that that cannot be from the South Knoll car. Right. So I began researching anything I could find about gunshots, but more specifically gunshot wounds to the head, and what happens when a bullet strikes a human head. What are the physics of it? What are the ballistics of it? What happens?
Don't tell me that you went on the internet and searched this.
That's exactly what I did. This is what I do for fun on a Friday night, right? But
were there many videos out there?
Just surprisingly, there's a lot.
Wow,
there
I would
really
never
are.
Thought that.
Because what I kind of started finding were videos of firing squad executions from World War II. And there's quite a few. There's quite a few actually American executions of Nazis and of American soldiers, guilty of desertion, which was a very serious thing, in the war.
And they filmed that back then. That's
crazy.
It
was filmed, and but usually the shot was from it wasn't to the head, it was to the body, and it was from somewhat of a distance, so you can't really see what's going on.
All right.
But I stumbled on this one video. And it was an execution of a firing squad execution of an Italian police chief. His name was Pietro Caruso, and he had been the police chief of Rome and had collaborated with the Nazis.
Okay, so that's why they shot him.
Yeah. So so in 1944, he was tried and convicted all in the same day, and then taken out for this firing squad execution.
And they filmed this.
And they filmed it. And Todd, let me. This is another weird coincidence, I guess, but I'm going to give you one guess as to this firing squad was made up of Italian soldiers.
Okay.
So I'm going to give you one guess as to what type of rifle these soldiers were carrying.
I'm going to say it's the same rifle that they found in the school book depository.
A 6.5 Carcano rifle, which was the standard, Italian rifle from World War II.
Crazy.
Yeah, I when I found this, I couldn't believe it, and this was a big deal, I guess, to the Italians because they filmed this execution from 3 different angles. One was fairly close up. There's slow motion of it, and so it's interesting too that they did their executions different than the way the Americans did. So in this one, they have him sitting in a chair, but he's sitting backwards in the chair so that if you sit and your chest is like on the back of the seat of the chair.
Right.
So he's sitting like that, and with his back to the firing squad. All right.
Isn't that the way Vinny from Welcome Back Kotter sat in a chair?
Exactly. It's exactly how he sat in the chair. For our listeners out there that are more of Todd and I's
Welcome Back Kotter
vintage of our age, that's going back a while. So the first shot that struck Caruso in this video, if you watch it in slow motion, it comes from a soldier that was to Caruso's right.
Okay.
Okay, and the soldier was standing, so he's somewhat up and back to the right of where Caruso's standing. Similar to Oswald, although not as elevated as Oswald would have been. And you see this bullet strike the head, and it strikes the left upper part of the back of Caruso's skull.
Okay.
It drives him forward and to the right. Okay, now that's a little detail that's going to be important later.
Okay.
But the bullet drives him forward and to the right. And so I'm looking at this thing, frame by frame. But the one thing that I noticed is that you can see the immediately when the bullet impacts him, you can see this distortion in his face that that you can't let me put it this way, you can't recreate this distortion in your face by blowing air out of your lips or anything like that. You could see this distortion that was just kind of a puffing out and just the way his skin was distorting.
It's kind of like a shock wave.
That's exactly what it is. Okay,
bullet going through.
When a bullet goes through human tissue, it deposits its energy, for lack of a better term, okay? And when in doing so, that it creates a shock wave, and the shock wave then makes the tissue, expand somewhat. It's called cavitation.
Okay.
And if people have ever seen videos of bullets in slow motion being shot through ballistic gelatin, you can see this shock wave and kind of how it creates almost a wave pattern. In the ballistic gel. Well, it does something similar, to a human. And you can, like I said, when you see this video, you watch it frame by frame, you can clearly see it.
Now, when you slow down the Zapruder film, what do you see?
Okay, so great thought, because I went to the Zapruder film and looked at this thing again in slow motion, frame by frame, and what I found was really interesting. So, a few frames before the head explosion, okay, and each frame is 1/18 of a second. So a few frames before, approximately a second before Kennedy's head explodes, you see this same distortion in his face begin that you see in Caruso's face when he's shot in the head.
So meaning a shot from the back.
Well, I'm assuming a shot from the back because what we know is from Dr. Mantic's analysis of the x-rays that he says there is a gunshot entry wound at the EOP. The autopsy doctors also said there was an entry wound near the EOP, that bump on the back of your skull, okay? So yes, so listen, and also too, we don't see any damage anywhere, there's no clear exit wound, which is interesting.
Okay.
So what I think what you're seeing is, because you also see Kennedy's hair kind of fly up, I guess what you call the bangs, and in his hair it was combed very neatly. Even though at this point in the Zapruder film, he's already suffered this wound to the throat, so he's in distress, but his hair is still somewhat neatly combed. But within a few frames before his head explodes, you see his hair, the bangs of his hair fly up, okay? And at the same time, you see this weird distortion in his face, and it's this big bulge that appears just below his right ear. And if you puffed up your cheeks, okay, there's no amount of puffing of my cheeks that I can get this kind of bulge to appear below my right ear. Over by my jaw. That's where you're seeing this bulge. And so when you compare a photograph of this guy that we know is being executed, this Italian police chief, and you look at this same photo of Kennedy, you see the same distortion in the face.
Okay.
So that's telling me that what you're seeing in the Zapruder film is you're seeing a bullet that has struck him at that bump on the back of his skull or near there, and is creating the shock wave that bullet now is the energy from that bullet is dispersing, and it's creating the shock wave that you can see this bulge in his face. Okay. But what's interesting is, or what there's a dilemma here, is that you don't see Kennedy's face blow out, which I would expect to see from a rifle shot. That's going to travel very fast. It's going to create some real damage, as we know actually did happen a few frames later.
Okay.
But nothing seemed to happen. So that, for the moment, let's talk about a wound that was not seen at Parkland, but that we know was observed at the autopsy, and that was a wound to the president's back. And it's disputed really where this wound was located, but it's a gunshot wound that's presumably of entry, and it's about roughly about the level of the third thoracic vertebrae, T3, right? The descriptions vary. Yes, this is another problem with the autopsy is wounds are just not specifically described, where they're located. But one thing that's documented in the autopsy report is when they attempted to probe this wound to see, where the path of it was, that it was shallow. It only went maybe an inch or so. And another problem with the autopsy is they didn't dissect that wound. They could have done that, but they didn't do that. So we don't know the exact path of that bullet, but we do know that when they tried to probe it, and they tried to probe it with a finger, which is also not good, but they could only get maybe the first joint of the finger into this wound. So,
and they did not recover a bullet from the body.
They didn't recover a bullet from no, that's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
From this wound.
Right. Exactly.
Back.
Okay. So, that's an interesting phenomenon. What causes a bullet to just make a 1-inch, wound like that? And so, a couple of years ago, there was a Secret Service agent, a former Secret Service agent that no doubt had been on that detail that day. He was on the car immediately behind the presidential limousine. His name is,
I think you're talking about Paul Landis.
Paul Landis, yeah.
And he was on the vice president's detail because also that day in the motorcade was the vice president.
Well, the vice president would have been behind, but actually, Landis was on Jackie Kennedy's detail.
Okay.
Yeah, he was assigned to, and so was, the only Secret Service agent that you actually see responding, Clint Hill, that jumped on the back of the limousine. He was also Jackie's.
Yeah, he was her detail leader.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and so Landis actually worked for him. But anyway, Landis wrote a book a couple of years ago that is pretty controversial because what he claims actually Landis's claims really there's no other conclusion you can draw is that there's a second shooter because he describes finding a bullet that presumably is what's called a magic bullet, and that's all part of what's called a single bullet theory that we're not really going into on this one, but Landis claims to find this bullet, and where the bullet's located is on the ledge of the limousine. This is a convertible, and so there's a ledge at the top of the back seat in the limousine, and Landis supposedly finds this bullet behind where Kennedy's sitting. When they got to Parkland Hospital, his focus was on Jackie. Obviously, that's his assignment.
Right.
But so in helping Jackie get out of the limousine and get the president out and all that, I'm sure it was very chaotic. Landis claims that he saw this bullet just sitting on the ledge behind where the president was sitting.
He does more than just see it. He actually picks it up.
Yeah, he picks it up, puts it in his pocket, and then stays with Jackie throughout the president's treatment, okay? And then just after the president's dead and they're getting ready to leave, Landis claims that he left that bullet on the stretcher at the president's feet, thinking that, they'll find this and this will be part of the investigation.
Right.
Now, Landis did not include that in his write-up after the assassination, and then he resigned from the Secret Service maybe a year later or so, and then claims that he never thought about this case again. It was traumatic. He just didn't want to visit it again until he ends up writing this book where he claims to have...
And he never testifies in front of the Warren Commission.
Never testified in the Warren Commission.
Right.
No, he did write, like I said, I think he wrote a couple of supplemental reports after the assassination, essentially describing, what he saw and heard and all that, but he didn't say anything about that bullet.
Okay.
So a lot of people dispute Landis's claims. I really don't know where I fall on it with him because... There's a couple of things that kind of undermine his findings, and maybe we've actually talked about this previously, Landis and stuff. So it's unfortunately, like most things in this case, there seems to be these just two competing sides, and nothing seems to be
As retired law
certain.
Enforcement, the minute you hear that and you think he picks up a piece of evidence and puts it in his pocket.
Yeah, exactly.
But then again, that's because we're sitting here today, 61 years later, saying, well, you shouldn't have done that. But you don't know at that moment when, like you said, there's chaos, there's so much going on.
I've said this before. You know this. We all know it. investigators make mistakes.
Right.
It happens. It happens in
Right.
every case, every investigation, because investigators are human beings. And so as long as you have human beings doing it, you're going to have mistakes.
Right.
And people under pressure in a chaotic situation, I mean, I can't imagine the level of chaos and pressure that they were under. You're gonna make a mistake.
Right.
It's gonna happen.
Right.
Okay.
And again, the mistake putting it in your pocket, but still, if that's where he found it, then this was more than breaking news for just that one day.
Right, because this supposedly, this wound in the back is what the Warren Commission concluded was the entry point of Oswald's a shot from Oswald that went through the president, came out the throat wound, okay,
Right.
and then went into Governor Connolly and caused I think 5 wounds in Governor Connolly, including shattering a wrist bone. So and then came out relatively undamaged. Now, like I said, there's a lot of controversy about that. We can do a whole episode just on that. But there's no way that bullet's going to go through 2 men and then somehow end up back on
behind the
president, because that bullet was actually supposedly found on a stretcher by an orderly in Parkland Hospital.
Right.
So you got 2 different bullets here that we're talking about.
Right.
Or somehow is this stretcher where the bullet was found was always supposed to be Governor Connolly's stretcher, but Landis claims he put it on Kennedy's stretcher. So
yeah, I
again,
guess
there's a lot of problems with it.
I guess he could have put that bullet on the wrong stretcher then.
So we got this shallow wound, okay, that's another issue. But how could you have a shallow wound, but then the Warren Commission claims that's the entry point, for the single bullet. But anyway, so the doctors said they could not probe this wound. It only went about an inch deep. And then you have Landis finding this bullet behind. So in trying to kind of maybe speculate about how do you reconcile this? How do you have this shallow wound and then maybe this bullet ends up behind Kennedy? Are we talking maybe about a bullet that's maybe a subsonic speed that is going way slower than a typical rifle bullet would go? So slow, in fact, that it didn't, it just penetrated the skin but didn't go all the way through, and then somehow ends up behind. I don't know.
But we've talked about this before, that there has been people that have committed suicide.
Yeah.
And shot themselves in the head with a firearm.
Yeah.
Sometimes that bullet exits. Sometimes it doesn't exit.
Yeah, we've said this in the last time that bullets do crazy things.
Right.
And I've actually seen as part, when I was in the FBI, it was a guy that committed suicide in a police interrogation room. How he got in there, because he had a .45 automatic pistol. How he got in there with that is a real problem.
Right. Again, made a mistake.
Exactly. It's a mistake. So they sit the guy down. Obviously they're going to be questioning him, and they ask him if he wants a bottle of water. Yeah, thank you. And so the cops walk out of the room. You see him sitting there. They bring the water into him, go back out for some reason. I guess they're getting ready for whatever they're going to interview him about. He takes the bottle of water, takes a sip, very carefully puts the cap back on it, and then pulls out a .45 automatic. He doesn't hesitate, puts it to his, to the side of his head, and pulls the trigger. And that wound did not exit. It didn't exit. And I didn't watch it in slow motion, but I bet if you did, you'd see that same kind of shockwave, and that same face distortion. But the bullet did not exit. It didn't exit his head. So that means.
And then you've had other suicides where the bullet actually hits the skull and then ricochets out.
Yeah.
And the person doesn't die.
There's all kinds of funky things that happens between bullets and humans, okay? And so if you have possibly, this one shallow wound, and maybe that's explained by a bullet that's undercharged or, subsonic, or is going way slower than a typical rifle bullet would be, is that maybe also what we're seeing in this, what I call the EOP shot, where you see this distortion in the president's head? There's no question that this bulging that you see is some kind of shockwave in his head. And is that also from the same shooter, maybe, that caused this back wound? that is shooting this undercharged or subsonic ammo. For whatever reason, maybe it's quieter. I have no explanation as to why that is. Maybe to limit the what's called overpenetration, so that nobody else, if you just want to kill the one person,
right?
And so maybe that's the reason that you see this. Because what's important is, going back to that video that I saw of the execution of the Italian police chief, I mean, the explosion of his head is instantaneous with the impact of the bullet, okay?
Right.
So that's a bullet that's going fast. And a bullet's lethality is from its speed. The faster it's going, the more lethal it is,
right,
generally speaking. And so but you don't see Kennedy's head explode. So that tells me that if this is a gunshot that entered at the back of his head, that it's slow enough that it didn't explode the head and it didn't exit. Okay? Because it happens a full second before you see the head explosion. So there's not going to be a second delay, between the shot impacting him and then all of a sudden exploding the head. It happens way quicker than that.
Right.
Okay,
right.
So again, this is implying that there's two shots. So that said, if you consider that the shooter from behind, and also I did all the same types of studies of possible bullet paths, bullet trajectories, and all that, and I will say that based on the position that the president's in at this time, he's kind of leaning forward, and where the limousine was, the lines and trajectories all pretty much point to that window on the 6th floor of the school book depository. It's all consistent with the shooter being there, where the Warren Commission said Oswald was.
Right.
So if you consider that shooter from the rear, and we're not making a statement either way on whether it was Oswald or not, okay?
Right.
But there's a shooter there. If you consider that shooter's using a bolt-action rifle, which more than likely he was, and it's a second when you see this cavitation, the shockwave in the president's head, and then it's a second later when you see his head explode, that cannot be from the same shot, because there's not enough time to operate the bolt of that rifle, aim, and take another shot. Okay, so that implies two shooters. Right. Okay, so going back to Dr. Mantic's analysis of those x-rays, and he said that there were two entry wounds. Well, the other entry wound that he sees in the x-rays of the president's head is at the right forehead, just inside, just in the hair, just inside the hairline, on the right forehead. And so, again, so to analyze this, to try to figure out maybe where this shot came from. If you consider it from overhead, and again, we'll provide some pictures of this, some graphics of this. The president was leaning forward at this point. We know this from the Zapruder film. He's leaning forward and somewhat to his left. Now his head is, so really the top of his head would have been kind of facing, forward.
Right.
And that's what, reminding everyone what's forward of him is the
South Knoll.
Is the South Knoll and the Triple Underpass. But the way that Elm Street curves, the top of the president's head would have been looking or facing almost right at the South Knoll, okay? Because of the way the curve of the street and the way that the limousine was going down Elm Street.
And again, the South Knoll, this is where you found that picture of the car parked up there.
Exactly.
Right.
So, I'm trying to assess, is it possible that that could this South Knoll car also have made a shot that, to the president's head? And so, again, drawing a line and looking at this from an overhead view, it certainly appears to line up. Now, the difference between this shot and the one through the throat shot, which had to go through the windshield, and there's a whole controversy about the windshield that I did not go into, and maybe that's something we can talk about at some other point. But there's equally enough to talk about on that single issue that we can just probably do a separate episode on it.
Right. Because just quickly for our listeners, there are people that say there was nothing wrong with the windshield. Other people say, no, the windshield had a crack.
That's right.
And it had some type of damage done
That's right.
to it.
Yeah.
So,
but what's important about at least this headshot is because Elm Street it's dropping. The elevation of it is dropping, probably at I think a 3 or 4 degree downslope.
okay.
By the time the limousine got to the position it was where Kennedy's headshot happened, that's about 6 feet lower than it was with the throat shot. And what that means is that now that South Knoll shooter can make a shot without going through the windshield.
Okay.
And I've actually done that. I've actually stood on that spot where the car is, where the South Knoll car was parked in the Cancellari photo. I've stood exactly on that spot, and I've taken a photograph of a car going down Elm Street in the middle lane, precisely at the spot where the headshot occurred. And we pretty much can pinpoint where that was because of the Zapruder film. And now the shrubbery is way thicker now than it was then, but you can see the
Right.
picture of the car. And I found a similar photo of the limousine, the presidential limousine, taken during that same Texas trip. It wasn't during the Dallas portion of the trip, but it was taken earlier. And the limousine, whoever the photographer taking the picture of, was at a similar angle, up and kind of looking down at the limousine. And you can clearly see the president, and there's a line of sight that a shooter with a scoped rifle would be a chip shot. I mean, it would be easy.
Okay.
Okay.
But how do you explain the president going back and then to the left in the Zapruder film?
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing because I think that back and to the left movement that you see after his head explodes, you see him go, violently back and he kind of falls over to his left side. That, I think, has made a lot of people that have looked at this, that's why they think that there's a shot from the grassy knoll, because that would be to the president's right, and presumably a shot from his right would make him, go back that way. It's consistent, and it makes sense. It really does.
Right.
But this is where I kind of part ways with the folks that believe that there was a shooter on the grassy knoll. If you do the same analysis, if you do the same analysis of the bullet path and bullet trajectories, right? The wounds that we know on the president, and I'm sticking with that the Parkland doctors were correct that there's a gaping hole in that right occipital region of the skull. The angles don't match up for a grassy knoll shooter to make that shot. So in other words, the grassy knoll shooter, his shot is going to have to make a somewhat hard left turn to then exit out that right occipital area. And because of the angle that the shooter would have been above, he's quite a bit elevated above the president at that point. That's going to be a shot that's going to go down, and when it exits, it's more than likely going to exit probably at the back of the limousine, on the back trunk lid of the limousine, because it's such a sharp angle. So the angles don't really work out for the grassy knoll shooter, for the wounds at least we know. But that movement is what people consider.
Right.
So I pondered this, and there's another researcher that her name was Sherry Feaster, and I actually had read some of her information, and I have to give her credit as the one that thought of this, and it actually makes sense. And so again, this is something that please forgive the graphic nature of this, and but it'll clearly make you understand how the president could have moved back into the left from a shot from the South Knoll. So if you consider that the presidential limousine, is a pool table, and that the president's head is a pool ball that you want to put in the right corner pocket, okay? And if you consider that the South Knoll shooter's bullet is the cue ball, you're going to aim that cue ball to the left side of the president's head to get him to go in the corner pocket.
Right.
So back, when you say back into the left, that's from the president's viewpoint. Okay. From the South Knoll shooter's perspective, that is back into the right.
To the right.
Okay.
Right.
And that's exactly how the president moves. But yeah, if you consider it as a pool shot, as maybe it's. I don't mean to make fun and to lessen the seriousness of this, but it is a way to understand the physics of it, of how that could happen. That a shot to the right forehead of the president could make his head go left. It's the same principle of a bank shot or a shot you're trying to hit and pull to make it go to the right.
All right. So with that, then the shooter can't be on the grassy knoll. But we can't dismiss that there was a lot of suspicious stuff happening on the grassy knoll at this time.
All kinds of problems.
A lot of witnesses have talked about things
all
that
kinds of problems with that. So, one of the things, Todd, that for me at least, that I find very suspicious about the grassy knoll is immediately after the president shot, you had almost everybody that would have been in the area running up that grassy knoll, including police officers, okay? That's where everybody thought that, not everybody, but a good number of people thought that they heard shots coming from there. And there's no doubt. I mean, there's
a response.
There's a response, and that's where people are drawn to. And so when these people actually get up there, they encounter a couple of guys that I think one was dressed in suit and maybe one was in civilian clothes that flash Secret Service credentials. Supposedly, we're saying, "Hey, there's nothing up here to see. It's nothing here. This is under control."
Right. But we know that there were no Secret Service agents posted up there.
That's exactly right.
The Secret Service agents.
Now they didn't know that at the time, obviously.
Right.
And it would make sense, okay, to someone at that moment. But we know now from the record that there were no Secret Service agents on the ground. They were all in the motorcade.
They were in the motorcade, or they were actually. One was still at the airport.
Yeah.
And then one might have still been in Fort Worth, and then there was another one at the Trade Center where the motorcade was going to go.
Right, but there was nobody on the ground in Dealey Plaza.
Right. And again, we talked about the grassy knoll. There's that famous photograph of the three men that were found in the train car up there.
Yeah.
A lot of conspiracy about them, and maybe we should do just a podcast on that, on those guys.
Because there's some interesting stories around that. So that's something to think about for sure.
We'll save that. Let our producer save that for later on.
So getting back to the grassy knoll, there were a number of employees of the railroad were standing on top of that triple underpass, which is a railroad bridge. Okay, and I'm quite sure that this was the Secret Service would not have liked this, but these guys were standing. Over the portion of that bridge where the presidential limousine would go immediately
just
under.
Seconds.
Yeah.
Just seconds. The motorcade.
And there's about 10 of these railroad guys that work there, and I think there was also a police officer up there with them. So these guys, or at least several of them, saw what they described as a puff of smoke, a lingering puff of smoke that came out of the trees that were along the grassy knoll from behind this fence. Also, I would say over half of the witnesses in Dealey Plaza, anywhere in Dealey Plaza that heard gunshots, regardless of how many they might have heard, described that when they first heard the shots, they thought they were firecrackers going off, and including these railroad workers up on the bridge. And
then that's not unusual. We know.
Because exactly.
Witnesses always describe a shooting as, I thought it was just fireworks.
Exactly, because we don't go around in our lives, luckily, anticipating that any minute we're going to hear a gunshot.
Right.
And so, I think the human nature is to try to fill in the blanks of, what we're hearing.
Right.
So they describe a majority of the witnesses just thought that they heard that they were firecrackers, and that includes Secret Service and law enforcement. Right. That's what they thought. And then also there were a number of witnesses, not as many that thought that they were firecrackers, but there were several witnesses that described the strong smell of gunpowder.
Okay. So what's your explanation on that?
Okay. So what I think what they're describing as firecrackers is exactly what they were, because all the years that I was in the FBI, and we went to firearms training once a quarter. So, I went to a lot of firearms over the years, right? I don't ever remember two things. I don't ever remember there being any lingering puffs of smoke.
Okay.
And we fired rifles, shotguns, and pistols And just modern ammunition just doesn't do that. And I don't also remember having, 5 or 6 shooters on either side of me at, when we're shooting, that I don't ever remember being knocked over or noticing that there's an overwhelming smell of gunpowder.
Okay. All right. So I guess
But what does leave lingering puffs of smoke, sounds like a firecracker, and leaves a really nasty smell of burned gunpowder, are firecrackers.
Right. And so you think that this was a diversion then?
That's what I think it was. I really do. I think because one of the things that as a sniper would want to consider is, you want to get the target, but you also want to be able to escape. Yeah, you want to make and so you want to get your target, but you got to have cover, concealment, and escape. Those are things that you have to.
And that's exactly what happened here, because Oswald got away.
Oswald got away,
and the second shooter.
Well, okay,
if there is a second shooter,
right? So if there's a shooter on that South Knoll, all he had to do, he's already in a car. All he had to do was just back out of that parking lot. He's about 75 yards from Houston Street. If he took a right on Houston Street, that leads him south out of downtown, and he's gone within a few seconds.
Right.
So I think, and again, this is where the folks that fall on the side that there was a conspiracy, I differ with. I don't think there was a shooter on that grassy knoll. I think it was a diversion.
Okay.
No doubt that implies that there's conspirators up there, and so that we're talking, maybe 4 to 5 people involved in this for this scenario to happen the way I'm drawing from doing this ballistic analysis.
Right. So do you think then that Oswald and the South Knoll shooter are working together?
It's an interesting question because, well, let me backtrack. I don't know what Oswald's participation was. There's some people that think he was absolutely innocent and that, had no participation whatsoever, was totally a patsy like he said he was when he was at the Dallas Police Department. I don't know. There's some suspicious activity on his part that you can't explain.
Right.
Because after the shooting, he leaves, he gets on a bus, and then the bus is going too slow, and then he gets into a cab. And when he eventually arrives at his rooming house, which is not far from downtown, it's in Oak Cliff, but when he arrives at the rooming house, he has the cab driver drive past the rooming house, like a block and a half past it. So then he walks back to the rooming house, and when he comes in, the landlady there, she's watching TV. Of course, it's all over that the president's been shot. Oswald bursts in the door, doesn't say a word to her, flies past her, comes out of his room a couple minutes later, and
he's changed clothes.
He's changed clothes, put a jacket on, and goes right out the door and never says a word to her. So he's in a hurry. He was a quiet guy anyway, by most accounts. So maybe not saying anything, but it's hard to imagine that you wouldn't say at least something to the lady that she spoke to him. Hey, wow, have you heard what happened?
Right.
And just human nature, when that kind of incident, people are gonna say, oh my God, whatever. He would have, normal people would have responded.
Whether she's listening to the radio or she's watching on TV,
exactly.
He's got to stop, and more likely than not, he's got to take a look at that.
Exactly.
Instead of just ignoring her.
He just blows past her. And then he's out the door almost immediately. And then shortly after that is when Officer Tippett is killed, not far from there, maybe less a mile or maybe a little less than that. And you cannot ignore Oswald either. You just can't. You really can't. There's a lot of things about his past that are, questionable. So was Oswald part of it or not? I don't know. And again, I'm not gonna say specifically on that. One last interesting thing is, though, if you consider that Oswald was a patsy, it doesn't make sense to have shooters set up in positions that from where
like
to
the
make
grassy
shots.
knoll.
Yeah,
It wouldn't
the
make
Oswald
sense
couldn't make that shot.
No.
And so unless the entire United States government is in on this thing, which I don't think it is, okay?
Right.
But you have to consider that if there's some objective investigation in this thing, they're going to realize, well, Oswald couldn't have possibly made this shot. So you don't want to have shooters in positions where, you can't explain that. So what's interesting is, again, returning to an overhead view of Dealey Plaza, where the shots are that come from the South Knoll, they line up almost perfectly with Oswald's position, at least on a line. Okay,
Right.
They're at different elevations, but overhead, it's just a straight line almost to each other. With when Kennedy's right in the middle of them. Right. So all that really had to happen is that any shots from the South Knoll shooter had to be reversed as exit wounds instead of entry wounds.
Right. And you change that around, and now you just have
Exactly.
you can call a single lone gunman to the back.
Exactly. And so that's where we need to get into the autopsy and what they found in the autopsy and the problems with that. And more importantly, what I think my suggestion is that a way to solve this case that we can do.
Well,
and
let's save that for part 3.
Exactly.
So
that's what
for
we're
our
gonna
listeners, don't forget, this is a 3-part series.
It's going to be compelling. I hope you found this compelling. I certainly have. And this is important stuff. It really is. And there just has to be answers to this.
Right. And to all our listeners, thank you so much for listening. Please share with your friends if you like it. Leave comments.
Yep.
Follow.
Yep. Keep that feedback coming. We love it. We want to hear it. We love doing this for you guys, and it's fun.
See you next time on part 3.
This has been the Back in Crime podcast presented by Texas Crime Travelers Todd Hiles and Stewart Fillmore. We are the executive producers. Grace Hiles is the producer and director. Theme music composed by Eddie Bandas. Follow us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and our YouTube channel at Texas Crime Travelers.